around a fire and they told each other stories. And the stories they told defined who they were, how they understood the world, what they believed, what was right and what was wrong, their vision of the future. By telling stories, our ancestors around the world created all of our different cultures. And it's fascinating to see how different people around the world, thousands of miles apart, developed very similar stories in their own language and tradition about good and bad, about the choices between right and wrong. Just think about your own first experience of listening to stories. Many of us have childhood memories of being read to at bedtime. Memories of the comfort and love of the bedtime story. It seems to be a basic human instinct for parents and grandparents to want to tell stories to their children from a very early age. For thousands of years, generations of children around the world have been told the same iconic stories. In our culture, successive generations are told the fables of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, Little Red Riding Hood, the Three Little Pigs, and Cinderella. Most of us can remember all those old fairy stories we learnt at a very young age. From our earliest years, we learn to listen to stories. In fact, at an early age, we actually begin to think in stories. They are how we make meaning of life. Stories explain how things work, how we understand our place in the world, our identity, and our values. And when we become adults, we use stories to help us to make decisions, to share what we know, and to influence other people. Some scientists claim that our brains are hardwired to listen to and tell stories. It's believed that stories are known to change the way in which people listen to another person or to think about an issue, even if they disagree. That's the power of story. Of course, as Sheena mentioned, the Bible, and in fact all the holy books, are bursting with stories. Jesus of Nazareth told many stories. The centre of the greatest story ever told was himself a storyteller. The Gospels are full of the parables told by Jesus. I remember learning in Sunday school the definition of a parable: an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. Those parables, like the Good Samaritan, are stories that, when understood and acted upon, have changed the world. That's the power of stories. Of course, in this land, we are a people of stories. From our ancient Celtic myths to our own storytelling traditions, from modern day writers to the classic stories inspired by this place. But every culture in the world has its own storytelling tradition. A few years ago, I led a storytelling workshop with international students in Germany. The postgraduate young people came from all over the world, and we explored the role of stories in starting wars and building peace. It was remarkable to hear young people from Syria, Bosnia, Nigeria, and Iran describe the ancient storytelling tradition in their own culture, and to hear how today's generation around the world is using digital media to share their stories. The students shared their own compelling stories of hope, peace, and reconciliation based on their personal experiences of conflict. Out of every story of violence, suffering, and loss, the young writers were able to create a sense of hope and possibility for a better future for their country and the world. However, we can also share powerful negative stories that radicalize and divide us, that spread fear and mistrust and hatred of the other. It's amazing how a negative narrative about a person, a place, a faith, a community, or a country can become embedded. We know all about this in our land. Most conflicts begin with sharing stories that spread fear, mistrust, and hatred of the other, whether these stories are true or not. We've also seen the devastating impact of hate-filled stories around the world, shared swiftly on social media. It's a sad fact that negative stories have the power to dehumanise. As Voltaire wrote, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. However, the opposite is also true. Sharing positive narratives and inspiring stories of peace and reconciliation can help to build a better future in polarised societies and in our divided world. Think of the words in the Sermon on the Mount, a Martin Luther King speech, the story of Malala, or the diary of Anne Frank. Replacing negative narratives with positive stories can bring light into the darkness. For many years, personally, I facilitated conflict resolution workshops in different countries as part of my personal commitment to creating a more peaceful and less violent world. This usually involved groups of 15 to 30 people exploring the theory and practice of conflict resolution. However, and we'll move on to the next slide for this, please. However, 14 years ago, I sat down and wrote my own personal story, my first book, Paperboy, a personal memoir about being a 12-year-old boy growing up in West Belfast in the 1970s and trying to come to terms with the Troubles. And that's where it's been, that's the musical version on the stage. And on the next slide, today, my wee story of a child's experience of the futility of war has probably influenced more people in more places than all of my decades of conflict resolution workshops. And that picture is a retelling on stage from the book of a march by the peace people in Belfast, where the women of the Falls walked across the peace line and were welcomed by the women of the Shankill, and they walked up the Shankill Road to a peace rally in Woodville Park. That's the power of story. The next slide, please. In recent years, I've spent time in Rwanda to learn about the incredible work of reconciliation since the genocide against the Tutsis in 1994, when 1 million people were killed in 100 days. I visited genocide memorial sites that left me unable to say or pray a single word. I saw the worst that human beings can do. But 25 years after the genocide, when I was first there, I visited storytelling workshops like this one in the villages. I heard incredible stories of reconciliation from perpetrators and survivors of the genocide. The next slide, please. This woman told the story of how she came to forgive this man, her neighbour, who killed her husband. Then I listened to this man, the man she had forgiven, share how he took responsibility and sought forgiveness for the pain and suffering he had caused her family. Survivors and perpetrators from the same village stood up in pairs like this together and shared similar stories of forgiveness and reconciliation. It was unforgettable and inspired me to co-write my latest novel, Kill the Devil, with a Rwandan screenwriter called Juventus Sabimana. I asked the villagers how they had managed to find reconciliation after such horror I was thinking of here. The answer was simple. No one mentioned theology or politics or peace and reconciliation funding. They said it was love. Then they asked me about reconciliation in my country. And guess what happened? In a remote village, nestling between the beautiful hills of Rwanda, the reconciled survivors and perpetrators of genocide told me they would pray for my land, that the walls that still divide our hearts and our streets would one day be torn down forever, that we too would know forgiveness and reconciliation. Traditional thinking by Western Christians is that we need to go to Africa to share the gospel. The missionary traffic is one way. I think we need missionaries from Rwanda to come here and teach us to practice what I call extreme forgiveness. The next slide has a quote. It's a Native American saying that it takes 1,000 voices to tell a single story. I believe that together we can create a web of powerful, positive stories to change the accepted narrative in this world from hatred to compassion, from ignorance to understanding, and from war to peace. That's the power of story. So what can we do this morning with these thoughts? I hope you remember the value of your own personal story. Every single one of us has a unique story. One great philosopher, whose words I take very seriously, once said these words. Next slide. Doctor Who, a Time Lord from the planet Gallifrey, once said, "We are all stories in the end, so make yours a good one." As you go forward today and every day, I pray you continue to write the pages of a good story. As the Nobel Peace Prize winner Elie Wiesel once said, people become the stories they hear and the stories they tell. That's the power of story. Amen.